The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned gray and overcast across the Pacific Ocean 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, and from the cockpit of his SBD-3 Dauntless dive bomber, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky scanned the empty horizon through his telescopic bombsight, knowing that somewhere beyond the cloud layer lay the most powerful naval striking force in human history. The Japanese mobile force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, approached Midway with 4 fleet aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers, carrying 272 operational aircraft manned by the most experienced naval aviators in the world. McClusky, leading Bombing Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise, understood that his 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers represented the United States Navy's last hope to prevent Japanese conquest of Midway Atoll and the potential invasion of the Hawaiian Islands. At 0530 hours, as the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu launched their first strike against Midway Atoll, Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the USS Enterprise received confirmation from a PBY Catalina flying boat that enemy carriers had been located bearing 240 degrees at a distance of 180 miles. The tactical situation facing Task Force 16 was stark in its mathematical simplicity. The Japanese possessed 272 combat aircraft against 233 American planes divided between 3 carriers and the Midway-based Marine Air Group 22. Japanese aircraft included the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, acknowledged as the world's most capable carrier-based interceptor, the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber, and the Aichi D-3 Naval dive bomber. American aircraft consisted primarily of the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighter, and the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber, the last being obsolete by 1942 standards. The strategic significance of the Battle of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical engagement between opposing carrier forces. Japan's attack on Midway represented the final phase of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan to achieve decisive victory over the United States Pacific Fleet and force American acceptance of Japanese dominance in the Western Pacific. The Japanese strategy, designated Operation MI, called for simultaneous attacks on Midway Atoll and the Aleutian Islands to draw American naval forces into a decisive engagement where superior Japanese numbers and experience would annihilate the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Success would provide Japan with advanced bases for future operations against the Hawaiian Islands and would demonstrate to the American public that continued resistance was futile. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6 1st Division, conducted his final weapons check as his SBD Dauntless climbed toward its attack altitude of 14,000 feet. The SBD-3, though lacking the speed and maneuverability of more modern aircraft, possessed characteristics that made it ideal for precision attacks against naval targets. The aircraft's Wright R-1820 Cyclone engine, producing 1,000 horsepower, could carry a 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb to a combat radius of 250 miles. More importantly, the SBD's perforated dive brakes allowed pilots to maintain control during vertical dives from high altitude, enabling accurate bomb placement against targets as small as individual ships. Best, a graduate of the Naval Academy and veteran of 2 years carrier operations, understood that his squadron's success would depend entirely on achieving complete surprise against Japanese carriers whose decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the mobile force from the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, faced tactical decisions that would determine not only the outcome of the Midway engagement but the entire course of the Pacific War. At 0700 hours, as his first strike force approached Midway Atoll, Nagumo received reports from the attack leader indicating that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize American air defenses. Simultaneously, scout aircraft reported contact with American naval forces northeast of Midway, though the composition and size of the enemy fleet remained unclear. The Japanese admiral confronted the classic naval aviation dilemma: commit his reserve aircraft to a second strike against Midway, or retain them for potential action against American naval forces whose exact strength and location remained unknown. The USS Hornet, newest of the American carriers participating in the Battle of Midway, launched her air group at 0806 hours under command of Commander Stanhope Ring. The Hornet Air Group, consisting of 35 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters, represented the largest American striking force committed to the battle. Yet the Hornets aircraft would play no role in the decisive phase of the engagement due to navigation errors that sent the entire air group searching for Japanese carriers in the wrong direction. Ring's navigation failure, though tragic in its immediate consequences, would prove strategically beneficial by convincing Admiral Nagumo that American air attacks were uncoordinated and ineffective. At 0920 hours, as Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet in their attack against the Japanese carriers, the tactical situation reached its critical turning point. Waldron's 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, approaching the Japanese fleet at low altitude without fighter escort, flew directly into concentrated fire from 42 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters and hundreds of anti-aircraft guns mounted on Japanese ships. The Devastators, cruising at 100 knots and unable to maneuver evasively while maintaining their torpedo attack approach, were systematically destroyed by Japanese defenses. Within 6 minutes, all 15 TBD aircraft had been shot down, with Ensign George Gay as the sole survivor. Waldron's sacrifice, though apparently futile, would prove decisive by drawing Japanese fighter cover down to sea level at the exact moment when American dive bombers approached from high altitude. The technical specifications of the aircraft involved in the Battle of Midway reveal the razor-thin margins that separated victory from defeat in naval aviation combat. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, powered by a 940 horsepower Nakajima NK-1C Sakae radial engine, could achieve a maximum speed of 332 miles per hour and possessed a climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute. The Zero's armament consisted of two 20mm cannons and two 77mm machine guns, while its extreme range of 1,400 miles enabled operations far from carrier bases. Yet the Zero's advantages in speed and maneuverability came at the cost of protective armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, making the aircraft extremely vulnerable to damage from American .50 caliber machine gun fire. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the Enterprise Air Group in the search for Japanese carriers, made the navigation decision that would determine the battle's outcome when he altered course toward the northwest at 0955 hours. McClusky, observing a Japanese destroyer heading northeast at high speed, correctly deduced that the warship was pursuing a damaged American aircraft and steaming toward the main Japanese fleet. His decision to follow the destroyer's wake, though based on tactical intuition rather than precise navigation, brought 37 SBD Dauntless dive bombers into position over the Japanese mobile force at the exact moment when enemy carriers were most vulnerable to air attack. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, positioned in a triangular formation 1,500 yards apart, presented targets that naval aviators had trained years to attack but never expected to encounter under such ideal conditions. At 1,022 hours, as McClusky's dive bombers began their attack, all three carriers had their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for strikes against American naval forces. The Akagi's deck contained 18 Nakajima B-5N Cape bombers armed with 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs, while the Kaga carried 21 aircraft in various stages of preparation. Most critically, aviation gasoline lines remained connected to aircraft throughout the rearming process, creating conditions where a single bomb hit could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. Lieutenant Richard Best, diving from 14,000 feet toward the aircraft carrier Akagi, achieved the perfect attack geometry that naval aviators practiced during thousands of training flights but rarely executed under combat conditions. Releasing his 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb at 1,500 feet altitude, Best scored a direct hit on the Akagi's flight deck just aft of the island's superstructure. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among stored torpedoes and aviation ordnance, creating fires that quickly spread throughout the ship's aviation spaces. Secondary explosions destroyed the Akagi's damage control systems and made firefighting impossible, forcing Admiral Nagumo to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara at 1,046 hours. Bombing Squadron 3 from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, achieved similar devastating results against the aircraft carrier Soryu at 1,025 hours. Leslie's squadron, approaching from a different direction than the Enterprise aircraft, caught Japanese defenders already engaged with McClusky's bombers and unable to concentrate anti-aircraft fire effectively. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck the Soryu within seconds, penetrating her flight deck and exploding in the hangar spaces where armed aircraft created massive secondary explosions. The carrier, blazing from stem to stern and listing heavily to starboard, would sink at 1913 hours with 718 of her crew. The aircraft carrier Kaga, largest of the Japanese carriers engaged at Midway, suffered the most devastating attack when 4 1,000-pound bombs struck her flight deck within a 2-minute period. The bombs, dropped by dive bombers from both the Enterprise and Yorktown, created multiple fires that merged into a single conflagration consuming the entire ship. Kaga's aviation gasoline storage, located directly beneath the hangar deck, exploded at 1,038 hours, killing most of the ship's engineering personnel and destroying her propulsion systems. The carrier lost all power and began settling by the bow, forcing her abandonment at 1,640 hours. Admiral Nagumo, observing the destruction of 3/4 of his carrier force within a 5-minute period, experienced the most rapid reversal of naval fortune in modern warfare. At 1,020 hours, the mobile force had possessed 4 operational aircraft carriers and maintained overwhelming superiority over American naval forces. By 10:25 hours, 3 carriers were burning wrecks and the 4th, the Hiryu, faced attack by the entire remaining strength of American naval aviation. The Japanese admiral, trained in battleship tactics and unprepared for the speed with which carrier warfare could shift from victory to defeat, found himself commanding a naval force that had lost most of its offensive capability in the time required to launch a single airstrike. The technical factors that enabled American success at Midway reflected both superior equipment design and tactical doctrine developed through intensive training. The SBD Dauntless dive bomber, though slower than Japanese aircraft, possessed accuracy characteristics that enabled precision attacks against specific points on enemy ships. The aircraft's telescopic bombsight, combined with pilot training that emphasized accuracy over speed, resulted in hit rates approaching 30% against ship targets, 3 times higher than horizontal bombing from high altitude. Most importantly, the SBD's structural strength allowed pilots to execute near-vertical dives from altitudes exceeding 12,000 feet, providing approach angles that Japanese anti-aircraft defenses could not effectively engage. The USS Yorktown, damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea 3 weeks earlier, had been repaired at Pearl Harbor in a feat of naval engineering that enabled her participation in the Midway engagement. Yorktown's presence provided Admiral Fletcher with a 3rd carrier for the battle, increasing American aircraft strength by 75 planes and giving American forces the numerical superiority necessary to attack multiple Japanese carriers simultaneously. The ship's rapid repair, accomplished in 72 hours by 1,400 Pearl Harbor naval shipyard workers, demonstrated American industrial capability that would prove decisive throughout the Pacific War. Captain Ryosaku Yonagimoto, commanding the aircraft carrier Soryu, chose to remain aboard his burning ship rather than abandon his crew, embodying the warrior spirit that characterized Japanese naval leadership throughout the Pacific War. Yonagimoto, locked in his cabin as fires spread throughout the ship, died when the Soryu's magazines exploded at 1913 hours. His sacrifice, duplicated by commanding officers throughout the Japanese fleet, reflected the cultural factors that made Japanese resistance so determined and Japanese defeat so catastrophic. The loss of experienced carrier commanders and aviation personnel at Midway would prove irreplaceable as Japan faced increasing pressure from American industrial production and training programs. The aircraft carrier Hiryu, surviving member of Admiral Nagumo's striking force, launched her counterattack against American carriers at 1,054 hours. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers and 6 A-6M0 fighters against Task Force 17, achieving success when 3 bombs struck the USS Yorktown's flight deck between 12:02 and 12:05 hours. The Yorktown, though severely damaged, remained operational and continued launching aircraft until a second Japanese attack at 1,445 hours scored 2 torpedo hits that forced her abandonment. Yet the Hiryu's success came at enormous cost. 17 of the 24 aircraft committed to the attacks were shot down by American fighter cover and anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant Commander Richard Fleming, commanding Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 from Midway Atoll, led the final American attack against Japanese carriers when 8 SBD Dauntless dive bombers attacked the Hiryu at 1,700 hours. Fleming's aircraft, hit by anti-aircraft fire during his dive, crashed into the Hiryu's after elevator and penetrated to the hangar deck, where its bomb detonated among stored aircraft. The resulting fires, fed by aviation gasoline and ammunition, spread rapidly throughout the carrier's aviation spaces and proved impossible to control. Fleming's sacrifice earned him the Medal of Honor and eliminated the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier at Midway. The strategic consequences of the Japanese defeat at Midway became apparent within hours of the battle's conclusion. Japan had lost 4 fleet aircraft carriers, 272 aircraft, and approximately 3,500 naval personnel, including many of the most experienced pilots in the Imperial Navy. American losses totaled 1 aircraft carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 307 personnel. More importantly, Japan had lost the strategic initiative in the Pacific War and would never again possess sufficient carrier aviation strength to conduct major offensive operations against American naval forces. The technological lessons learned during the Battle of Midway would influence naval aviation development throughout the remainder of World War II. The effectiveness of dive bombing attacks against heavily defended targets led to improved bombsight design and pilot training programs emphasizing precision over volume of fire. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers to secondary explosions caused by aviation gasoline and armed aircraft resulted in improved damage control procedures and hangar deck fire suppression systems. Most significantly, the battle demonstrated that naval superiority could shift decisively within minutes, forcing fleet commanders to maintain constant readiness for both offensive and defensive operations. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours floating in the Pacific Ocean within sight of the Japanese fleet, observing the destruction of enemy carriers from his position in the water. Gay's account, recorded after his rescue by American search aircraft, provided detailed information about Japanese damage control procedures and tactical responses to air attack. His survival testimony became a crucial element in post-war analysis of carrier warfare tactics and influenced American naval aviation doctrine throughout the Cold War period. The human cost of the Battle of Midway extended far beyond the immediate casualty statistics. Japanese naval aviation, built around a small cadre of highly experienced pilots who had trained for years before the war, could not replace the personnel losses suffered during the engagement. American aviation training programs, designed for rapid expansion and mass production of pilots, could replace losses and continue expanding throughout the war. The mathematical advantage gained by American training capacity would prove as decisive as any technological superiority in determining the Pacific War's outcome. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carrier striking force, received reports of the disaster at Midway with the recognition that Japan's window for achieving decisive victory had closed forever. Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most capable naval strategist, understood that American industrial capacity would produce naval forces that Japan could never match if the war continued beyond 1942. The failure at Midway guaranteed that Japan would fight a defensive war of attrition against an enemy whose strength would increase exponentially with each passing month. The Battle of Midway marked the end of Japanese naval aviation's qualitative superiority over American forces and the beginning of a period in which American material advantages would become increasingly decisive. The Zero fighters that had dominated Pacific skies since Pearl Harbor could no longer maintain air superiority against improving American aircraft and better-trained pilots. The Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers that had proven so effective against undefended targets at Pearl Harbor and in the Dutch East Indies could not survive against coordinated fighter and anti-aircraft defenses. Most importantly, Japanese carrier doctrine, which emphasized offensive strikes at maximum range, proved vulnerable to American tactics that accepted heavy losses to achieve decisive results. Captain Mark Mitcher, commanding the USS Hornet during the Battle of Midway, learned tactical lessons about carrier aviation coordination that would influence his leadership of Task Force 58 during the decisive campaigns of 1944. Mitcher's experience with the navigation failures that prevented the Hornet Air Group from participating effectively in the battle led to improved coordination procedures and communication systems that would prove crucial during the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf engagements. The institutional learning that occurred throughout the American naval aviation community as a result of Midway would provide decisive advantages during subsequent carrier battles. The aircraft recovery operations conducted by American carriers following the Battle of Midway revealed both the strengths and limitations of 1942 naval aviation technology. Many SBD Dauntless dive bombers returned to their carriers with less than 10 gallons of aviation gasoline remaining, having exhausted their fuel during extended searches for Japanese forces. The narrow margin between mission success and aircraft loss emphasized the importance of accurate navigation and fuel management in carrier operations. These lessons would influence the design of longer-range aircraft and improved navigation equipment that characterized American naval aviation later in the war. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, flying an SBD Dauntless from the USS Enterprise, achieved one of the most photographically documented bomb hits of the Pacific War when his 1,000-pound bomb struck the aircraft carrier Kaga's flight deck near the island superstructure. Dickinson's attack, captured by his rear seat gunner on 16mm film, provided detailed documentation of dive bombing techniques that would be used for pilot training throughout the war. The film footage, showing the bomb's impact and the resulting explosion, became an iconic representation of American naval aviation's precision capabilities. The Japanese destroyer Erasure, racing to rejoin the mobile force after depth-charging the American submarine USS Nautilus, inadvertently led Wade McClusky's dive bombers directly to the Japanese carriers. The destroyer's wake, visible from high altitude as a white line across the dark Pacific, provided the navigation reference that enabled American aircraft to locate their targets at the crucial moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable. This chance encounter demonstrated the unpredictable factors that could determine the outcome of naval engagements and the importance of maintaining tactical flexibility in rapidly changing combat situations. The salvage attempts conducted on the damaged aircraft carriers Akagi and Kaga revealed the devastating effectiveness of American dive bombing attacks against ships designed primarily for offensive operations. Both carriers, though not immediately sunk by bomb hits, suffered secondary explosions and fires that made damage control impossible. The Japanese Navy's emphasis on offensive capability over defensive survivability, which had proven successful during the early phases of the Pacific War, became a critical weakness when facing an enemy capable of achieving tactical surprise and precision attacks. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had positioned American naval forces at Midway based on intelligence intercepts that revealed Japanese operational plans in advance. The breaking of the Japanese Naval Code JN-25 provided American commanders with detailed knowledge of enemy intentions, timing, and force composition that enabled tactical decisions based on accurate information rather than speculation. The intelligence advantage gained through cryptographic success would prove as important as any material factor in determining American victory at Midway and throughout the Pacific War. The aircraft launching procedures employed by Japanese carriers during the Battle of Midway reflected operational doctrines developed during peacetime training that proved inadequate under combat conditions. Japanese carriers could launch large airstrikes quickly but possessed limited capability to conduct defensive operations while rearming aircraft for different missions. American carriers, designed with flexibility for both offensive and defensive operations, could maintain fighter cover while simultaneously preparing strike aircraft for launch. This tactical flexibility would prove increasingly important as the war progressed and American forces faced coordinated enemy air attacks. The medical treatment provided to wounded aircrew during and after the Battle of Midway demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of 1942 naval medicine. Ships' medical officers, trained primarily in treating conventional battle injuries, faced new challenges in caring for aircrew who had suffered burns from aviation gasoline fires and injuries from high-altitude bailouts. The experience gained during Midway would lead to improved flight surgeon training and specialized equipment for treating aviation-related injuries throughout the remainder of the war. The strategic intelligence assessment conducted by Japanese naval headquarters following the Battle of Midway revealed fundamental misunderstandings about American industrial capacity and national determination. Japanese planners had assumed that heavy naval losses would force the United States to negotiate a compromise peace that would leave Japan in control of the Western Pacific. The American response to Midway, immediate authorization for expanded shipbuilding programs and accelerated pilot training, demonstrated that American strategy was based on achieving total victory rather than accepting territorial concessions. The impact of the Battle of Midway on Japanese naval morale extended far beyond the immediate participants in the engagement. News of the defeat, though censored by military authorities, gradually spread throughout the combined fleet and contributed to a growing recognition that Japan could no longer achieve decisive victory over American forces. The psychological transformation from confident offensive operations to defensive preparation for American attacks would characterize Japanese naval operations throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The tactical innovations developed during the Battle of Midway would influence naval warfare throughout the Jet Age and beyond. The importance of achieving tactical surprise through coordinated attacks from multiple directions became a fundamental principle of carrier aviation doctrine. The effectiveness of precision weapons against high-value targets led to continued emphasis on accuracy over volume of fire in naval aviation training. Most importantly, the battle demonstrated that technological superiority could be overcome by superior tactics, training, and intelligence lessons that would remain relevant throughout the Cold War period. For the families of American servicemen killed during the Battle of Midway, victory came at a personal cost that could never be fully compensated by strategic success. The wives, parents, and children of the 30 airmen from Torpedo Squadron 8 who died in their attack against Japanese carriers received telegrams stating that their loved ones had died heroically in defense of their country. The disconnect between strategic necessity and personal loss would characterize American involvement in World War II and influence public attitudes toward military casualties throughout the post-war period. The maintenance and logistic support required to keep American aircraft operational during the Battle of Midway revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of 1942 naval aviation technology. Aircraft mechanics working on carrier hangar decks under combat conditions performed repairs and maintenance that enabled damaged aircraft to continue flying missions. The improvised solutions developed during the battle, using parts from destroyed aircraft to repair flyable ones, modifying ammunition loads based on available supplies, and extending aircraft range through fuel conservation techniques, would become standard practices throughout the Pacific War. The weather conditions during the Battle of Midway, overcast skies, scattered cloud cover, and variable visibility, influenced tactical decisions throughout the engagement. American dive bombers used cloud cover to approach Japanese carriers without detection, while Japanese aircraft struggled to locate American naval forces in poor visibility conditions. The ability to operate effectively in marginal weather would become increasingly important as the war progressed and both sides attempted to gain tactical advantages through superior meteorological forecasting and navigation capabilities. The Battle of Midway represented the last major naval engagement in which battleships played no significant role in determining the outcome. The massive battleships that both sides had positioned near the combat area, including the Japanese Yamato and the American task forces built around older battleships, never came within gun range of enemy forces. The triumph of aircraft carriers over battleships, begun at Pearl Harbor and completed at Midway, would reshape naval strategy throughout the remainder of the 20th century and establish air power as the dominant factor in naval warfare. The legacy of June 4, 1942, extended far beyond the immediate tactical results of the carrier engagement northwest of Midway Atoll. The young American pilots who had attacked Japanese carriers with obsolete aircraft and achieved decisive victory against overwhelming odds had demonstrated that democratic societies could produce military forces capable of defeating any totalitarian enemy. Their courage under fire, combined with superior intelligence, industrial capacity, and tactical flexibility, had turned the tide of the Pacific War and ensured that the United States would possess the strategic initiative necessary to achieve total victory over Imperial Japan. The mathematical precision of the victory achieved at Midway, 4 Japanese carriers sunk in exchange for 1 American carrier lost, reflected not only tactical skill but the industrial and technological advantages that would characterize American military operations throughout World War II. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers that had achieved such devastating results against Japanese carriers represented the product of American aviation industry, pilot training programs, and tactical doctrine that could be expanded indefinitely to meet the demands of global warfare. The Japanese carriers destroyed at Midway could never be replaced in sufficient numbers to restore the naval balance that had existed prior to June 4, 1942. In the end, the Battle of Midway had accomplished far more than preventing Japanese conquest of a small atoll in the Central Pacific. The American victory had preserved the strategic balance necessary for eventual offensive operations against Japan and had demonstrated that American naval aviation possessed both the technical capability and the tactical skill necessary to defeat the most experienced naval air force in the world. The young men who had flown SBD Dauntless dive bombers against overwhelming odds on that gray morning in June 1942 had changed the course of world history and ensured that the Pacific Ocean would remain open to navigation by democratic nations committed to individual freedom rather than totalitarian empires built on military conquest.